Hi, welcome to Your Next Door Neighbor. Our guest this week is
Maiina Stefanovska,
Tell us a little bit about her.
professor at U.C.L.A., one of our next door neighbors, one of your next door neighbors. Interesting story. Comes from a faraway land with an accent. Arrived here in the United States, got rid of most of the accent. An American success story, really, is what Maiina happens to be. And
Yeah, her story is amazing because she came from Yugoslavia and was there while President Tito was in charge. And so, although she never met him, as you'll hear in this broadcast, she was heavily influenced by him. And to hear a different perspective on the world that we have grown accustomed to, I found fascinating.
well, yeah, because it's her early youth was not American like we know, like most of our next door neighbors, like a lot of our next door neighbors, where there's a lot of them are foreigners, immigrants, emigrated from their country to here, and this is her story. So we hope you enjoy it.
Your next door neighbor.
Maiina Stefanovska.
My name is Maiina Stefanovska, and I was born in Belgrade, Yugoslavia then. Although I was conceived in Istanbul, where my parents were. That's what they told me. My mom came to give birth to Belgrade.
Where are your parents from?
Both are from Macedonia. They were immigrants to Belgrade right after the Second World War. My father got this promotion job because he spoke Greek and he worked in the intelligence for then Yugoslavia and then became a diplomat. Why did he speak Greek? Because he was a partisan in Greece and in Macedonia, meaning fighter against the Germans. That's where they met, actually. Both were fighters. Yeah, I have pictures of my mother and my father with the rifles. And I was born in Belgrade. My family spoke Serbian to us as children. That was my first language. But they spoke Macedonian or Greek with their relatives. So I was kind of brought up in these two or three languages. Greek being very different, and supposedly, according to family lore, when I was 3 and they wanted to say something secret, they would always speak in Greek. And so at one point, around the age of 3 or 4, I told them, you don't need to speak Greek, I understand anyhow. And so, as you can imagine, I am interested in languages. And
So where did you grow up?
I grew up both in Belgrade and in several other French-speaking countries where my father lived, namely in Africa. So Paris, that's not Africa, obviously, Tunisia, and the Congo. The last one was the Congo. I was already a college student. My first 2 years of college were there.
So what years were these in the Congo?
Seven-
And actually, what year were you born? To back up a little, to see how far past the
Okay.
war.
Well, yeah, I was born in 1952. The country was still quite poor. The stories that I remember, the most poverty story, let's say, my mother never wanted to make potatoes or beans or like cabbage when I was growing up, already grown up, because she said I ate so much of the cabbage and beans when I was a student. And after the war, I just can't take it anymore. Another story is that she bought an orange for me when I was 1 year old. And she opened it and the orange was rotten and she cried.
Now, did your parents know Tito?
My father had met Tito several times. I even have some pictures of them.
And Tito, of course, was the ruler of
He
Yugoslavia.
was the ruler. He was also kind of an ideal figure or idol or,
Right.
very well respected. I was at that time, when I was 6 and 7, I was a pioneer. This was the prequel to the communist or socialist youth. We didn't call ourselves communist, but there was a communist party, of course, but not the state. So I remember that I wrote a letter to Tito, and Tito answered me. Of course, he had a secretary sign the letters, but a 7-year-old was very ecstatic about that.
And your dad was in the diplomatic corps?
Yes, yes. So he
So
was,
how did he go from partisan to diplomatic corps?
well, he was actually, did not have a college education, but he had like semi-college accountant, economics, not a high school, but like a, community college type education. And then he went to the partisans. He was well respected, by the partisans, and of course the government after the war became the communist, socialist. Here you would say communist, we called ourselves socialist. And because he happened to speak Greek, he was an officer in the army, because he happened to speak Greek, they called him to Belgrade because they needed intelligence people who spoke Greek. And so then he advanced from intelligence to diplomacy. And that's maybe why he was sent to Istanbul as a consul general. That was the beginning of his career.
Now that was before you were born.
Yeah, that was.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that was for Tito?
Yes.
Of course.
Because
of course.
he was an authoritarian, wasn't he? Didn't he eliminate most of
He was a dictator, wasn't he?
the opposition?
Oh.
Yeah.
You don't think? Okay, tell me why you think he wasn't a dictator.
It's very complicated. I don't think you can say a dictator in those circumstances. He navigated between the East and the West.
Mm-hmm.
He was first brought up, kind of raised by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, but then he got into a conflict with Stalin, and we were actually the first ones, way before France or any Western communist, to break ties, and there was a big economic clamp down on Yugoslavia then. And so that was in 1948, only 4 years before I was born. So yes, dictator, I would not say. We had a one-party system, and that was as close as we would get to the dictatorship. After the 60s, it was we didn't need to get a visa to get out of the country. In the 50s, it was still rough. After the 60s, 65, we were free to go in and out. We were the only country who was free, and we were at that time way better off than all the other Eastern Bloc, that we were not part of the Eastern Bloc. And in 56, we were scared of a possible invasion from Hungary, and in 68 too, and that I remember because we were kind of on the watch out and preparing, like what would I do if there would be violence and an invasion? Would I defend my country at 18, or would I just fly away, hide or something? It was a question that we kind of asked ourselves, the young people, so it was in the air.
What was the answer?
Yeah.
What did you ask you? It didn't happen. It didn't have to come to that.
It didn't have to come to that. I don't think that I was ready to go to war for even a country that I loved in a way, but not that much.
So Tito famously kept all these different cultures together from fighting with each other. How do you think he did that?
Well, Tito was a Croat, but he gave maybe, the capital was Belgrade, the capital of the whole country. He gave enough power to the Serbs with being a Croat, so I think he kind of balanced that in a way. There was a very strong call for unity at that time. That's what created Yugoslavia. We were not Yugoslavia before the war. In fact, there was a Yugoslavia, but for example, Macedonia was not recognized as an kind of somewhat independent federated republic with their own language. From 45, it was. So was Slovenia. So we were at that time pretty close to being an example to even Western countries. At that time means maybe a little later in the 70s, something like that. Because I know that because I worked in the Yugoslav government then. I was a young woman. I had finished my studies.
What college did you go to?
I went in the Congo Brazzaville my first 2 years, and then the rest in Grenoble in France, Grenoble in the Alps. I can tell you about living in the Congo for 2 years. It was a very important experience for me, very important. I had never been in such a different country. I didn't even know it existed. I had never been one single white woman among all black people. And that I had never seen a black person from close. Supposedly I had an African friend when I was very little, somebody who was the child adopted by parent friends, but I don't remember that. In the Congo, the first impression I will never forget of my first lecture of going to the university, the encounter with the other. But it was wonderful because this other, other like otherness, I didn't have any labels for them. I had no idea, no fear, no not fear, no nothing. I didn't even think of it. First day of the classes, I was, of course, a little late. I opened this door of this big amphitheater, and there are about 100 people probably, and they all turn around because I'm late, and they look at me, and there, as I later saw, there were about 5 women. Everybody else was very dark black male. And I was like, just completely flabbergasted, but not scared, not just completely, I don't know how to explain it. So nothing, I sit down and I listen. And the first year, I'd spent 2 years there. The first year I was trying to be friends with white people, meaning maybe my sister's friends, a little younger than I am, daughters and sons of diplomats, French mostly, or people, but actually I didn't like that mentality at all. These were the colonial, whatever, mentality, awful ideology. And I came from a socialist country, and the Congo Brazzaville was socialist. I felt closer to them than to these French people. So the second year I became more friends with my classmates, and I still have friends. I'm still keeping in touch after almost 50 years now, 40 years for sure. They were very different from me. We had discussions. It was quite something because at the same time, they also accepted me. They didn't like the French people, but I was as unknown to them as they were to me.
Because the French were colonizers?
Yes. Definitely, they had an attitude towards the French and the French towards them. And it's hard to get out of that mold on both sides. I was accepted and the French were not. Mm-hmm. Europeans in general, I don't know that there were many at all, so I cannot say anything general about them.
Right.
At the university, there was one other French woman and me, and the rest were Congolese women and mostly men.
So you go to school there for 2 years.
Yes.
Was that your first 2 years or your last 2 years?
First 2 years.
So then where did you go from there?
Then I went to Grenoble in France to finish because this was the French system, so I had to, most logically, to continue in the French system. And
what was that? That must have been a big contrast between the Congo and Grenoble.
Completely different, yeah.
And was this your family moving around?
No,
your father, or were you?
The Congo, yes. That's why I went there. But in Grenoble, I was on my own. That was the first time in my life I was on my own. I had to find a place and study, So they were giving me my monthly allowance. It was okay. Everything else was on me, and I was 20 years old then. But I think I was unconscious, therefore brave. I have no idea. I mean, it was fun. It was fun.
And what was your major?
English language and literature.
Oh, wow. And how did you pick that?
Well, when I first started my studies, first of all, in the high school which I finished in Belgrade, we were all studying science a lot more than the humanities. And because of all my friends went to the science, whatever specialization, I did too. And so I was going to study something like organic chemistry after that. And the reason I never did that is that I went to the Congo to spend 1 year with my parents because they were there already. I had been alone with my uncle and aunt in Belgrade. And so I thought, well, what will I do there? I'd better study something. I'm not going to sit at home. And it seemed that learning English was a good idea. French I already spoke, so I couldn't learn it. French literature, I was a little scared of literature. They would be better than I am. So English, that's how I think my life, I mean, it has served me, I suppose, being nearsighted in a way. Like mentally nearsighted, if you see what I mean. In some ways, I'm, cautious and plan and so on. But in some other ways, not really. So I studied English because, well, it was good to know another language. Maybe I would have studied Chinese if they had Chinese, but they didn't, so English, why not? And it's a big language for sure. I loved England, and I spent a year in England after my studies. I liked the way English spoke. I liked their countryside. London was... I had no idea about the United States. No idea. Nothing, because we didn't have TV when I was growing up. And when we had it, I watched it very little. I wasn't hooked on it.
We think everybody knows about everything that happens here in the United States. That's really sort of profound that you and your friends and your generation didn't know what was going on in the United States other than something that was...
Right. We knew about Vietnam and about the 68 protests, but I had the hardest time. I wouldn't be knowing who were the presidents or how life was like, or what what people thought.
Fashion, music?
So music, we were listening to a lot more to the English bands, rock, English rock. Very little American, like the what is it, the Doors? What is that?
The Doors are American, yeah. That would be an example.
Yeah.
No, she's talking about an example non-American.
No, but
she's
the
talking about
Doors,
an example American,
we
that
didn't
English
know
music.
them. Who is buried in Paris?
Yeah, the Doors, Jim Morrison. He's buried in Paris, yeah.
So I didn't know about them that much at all. I knew the English bands, and that's what was popular when I was an adolescent.
How about rhythm and blues, like Aretha Franklin and Marvin Gaye?
That was a little later. Yeah, we knew that definitely. Yeah.
And what was it like hearing that? I mean, talk about different culture. I mean, that's... What was that like? Do you have any memories of like the first times you heard it? I mean, I remember the first time I heard Aretha Franklin. I was in 7th grade, and I was like, I didn't know where that was coming from. It was such a revelation to me.
I see.
Were there moments like
So
that?
I don't remember like the first time, because even as little exposed as I was to American music, still we were exposed. So I can't say that we were not exposed at all and that this was completely new. I mean, for me, Aretha Franklin is funny because I sometimes see the African Americans as closer to the Macedonians, for example.
Why?
This is very strange. It's nothing to do with the color, of course, there's no color, but more poor, more in the south, eating similar things, laughing in a similar way, being kind of not elegant sometimes. It was like, axed him, and this kind of, body language reminds me of my aunts. That's how they were,
Right.
So, and just eating, like my father came here and we go to the market in Baltimore and we see chitlins. Do you know what that is?
Yeah, sure.
Schwarzi. Oh my God, that's what we eat back home. So he's like, oh my God, it's our food. How did they know? Okay, so I don't know. Or okra. We eat okra in Macedonia, and only, the south here. So, in some ways, so Aretha Franklin, we have these gypsy singers who would be dressed like her, and kind of to rhythm and perfect rhythm, perfect music, but popular peoples. It's not elegant, it's not kind of like classical music, it comes from here.
Right.
So for me, it wasn't such a surprise, for example, it wouldn't be. I can't say that I heard too much of this music back home. I was much more into French, other, like maybe, African, what you would consider now maybe
Right.
new, whatever, music. Then when I came here, I learned.
And what about films?
So films we knew everything I knew was from films, yeah. And be it westerns, be it some TV series or something, that's what I knew. I wasn't particularly, I don't remember that the films made a deep impression on me, because I was always maybe a little, I didn't like violence or, westerns or shooting films, so it's not like this is for the boys. I liked the French New Wave, it was a little more about chatting and experimenting and so on. But that's very, like, rough division. It's
Did
not
Yugoslavia have a film industry?
Yeah, we had good films, like the Czech Republic in those years. We had some excellent films. In fact, I have one rented here. It's called No Man's Land. I recommend it. It's a film about the conflict in Bosnia. It's like a tragedy. It's funny, and then it ends like, that's very. Of course, the Americans were not well seen. It was Vietnam and all of that. But then we knew that there were anti-Vietnam protests here as well. So it was political, kind of. I knew the news, political news. But about the life here, no. So when I came to visit with my sister, who was the first one to come and work in the United States, or study rather. So I came with her.
Where to? What city?
The first, Eugene, Oregon.
Wow. That's out there. What year was that?
That was in 82.
That was
They
your
were
first
kind
time?
of developed then.
80.
Yeah. So that was the first time in the United States.
Yes.
Okay.
And you know what? I thought, wonderful country. Because I thought everywhere it was like Eugene, Oregon. Green,
Right.
hippie,
Yeah.
some beautiful people, very easygoing, like, hi, how you doing today? People in the street. I was very surprised when I finished a master's there and went to Baltimore to do a PhD. That was very different. So when I came back from my studies, I spoke then English okay, not so well, but French excellently and so I started looking for a job, and I did get a job at first, or as a journalist in the greatest Belgrade or Serbian newspaper, but I also got another job offer. These were two offers, and I chose the other. And this was to be an interpreter in the Federal Ministry for Labor and Social Affairs, which is part of the federal government. So that job was kind of prestigious. I traveled a lot with delegations.
Inside of Yugoslavia or outside?
Mostly outside, and some inside as well. We would welcome a foreign minister, and then we would be taking him to Dubrovnik, for example, or somewhere. But mostly I traveled and I met a number of famous figures, Giscard d'Estaing, the French president, and I was at the Élysée Palace and I had dinner there. Well, it would be too much to say that I had dinner. I was attending a dinner, but I wasn't eating, I was translating. I met Saddam Hussein, believe it or not. These were the good years still. It was in 72 or 3 that I got that job.
And were you working with your father at all as a translator?
No,
Did
not at
you
all.
cross paths?
No, no.
So what was Saddam like when you were with him?
He was, you know, at that time he was liked.
Right.
And the Yugoslav engineers and technicians were building a huge amount of Baghdad, and so their cooperation, economic cooperation, was quite strong. And we were two socialist leaders. I mean, we were two socialist countries. That's how I saw it. And indeed, it was a lot more liberal, Iraq was, than any other country. Women were not necessarily veiled at all. I mean, and they were going to the university, and they were doctors and so on. So I had kind of positive view. Of course, you know, these politicians, what can I say? They're all somewhat full of themselves. Very few of them ever paid attention to me as a person. And if they did, maybe it wasn't the way that I wanted them to pay attention. So issues dealing with labor, and we had our workers all throughout Europe. Sweden, for example, we visited as such because we were negotiating social security for them, or laws, or you know, how to, when they return, or money or health, all these kind of things. Or sometimes delegation for economic cooperation. That's how I met Saddam Hussein and the president of Guinea, another dictator, Sekou Touré. So I traveled quite a bit then, and it was, for 5 years I worked as an interpreter. I was a consecutive interpreter. So when you have a delegation, you don't have people in a booth and with microphones.
Right.
You're really person to person. So basically, you say one sentence and I translate it.
Oh.
Then the other person says one and I translate it. So that's pretty easy. I have a good short-term memory, not a very good long-term memory, but I can switch the languages very easily. Yeah, I'm verbal. I did one time interpreting, simultaneous interpreting. That's what they do in Geneva and in New York in the United Nations. It's really hard. It's very hard. I had the speech written so I could just listen to what he was saying and just kind of, you know, and it was more or less written. But that's a skill that you learn in special schools. And even if you know it, people are so stressed and so frazzled. They only have 20-minute stints to interpret and then 40 minutes to rest. Because it's so stressful. It's like it's like breathing and singing at this, you know, like the didgeridoo or whatever you have. You're doing these two things that are just a little off. You're listening to the end of the sentence and you're saying the beginning of it's impossible. It's very hard.
Yeah, did he say, push the button for the nuclear weapon, or don't push the button for the nuclear weapon?
That, yes, that. And then, wait a minute, there are the accents. United Nations. But you're from the Indians who speak like that in English. To the Sudanese who speak like that. And the accents are very strong. And all the delegates, and they get very upset, they have a fight, they speak very fast, they speak about medicine, about, you know, health issues, about different hospitals, malaria, whatnot, you know, the discussion, pesticides, and the interpreters have to know all of that. They're very highly paid, but that was not my... After 75, when, if you remember, everybody had a petrol crisis, and so we had been very indebted, we took on high debts from the West, as usual, Americans included, but whatever, other nations, and suddenly they were asking for that money back. So we had to pay a huge interest, and the country was just not doing so well. The money was spent probably not that great ways, and then the ethnic problems had started. When the cake gets smaller, it's harder to divide it, and so on. So I worked in the government, and I had by then advanced to a more responsible than being an interpreter. I was having my specialty. I had studied some economics in the meantime, so I was like promoted basically. But unfortunately, although I was one of the youngest, whatever officials to be at the OECD meetings, I would come back home and I had to lie to a degree when I was out there, telling them, yes, we're doing this and that for the workers. But no, we're not doing anything because we didn't have the money. And so I didn't feel very comfortable with that at all. I saw that things were not going well. And in my private life, I was then 27. I was going nowhere as well. Like, okay, either I'll get married to some... Nothing was happening exciting for me, nothing. And so when my sister came to the United States to be a student, I came with her, visited Eugene, loved it, and came and gave my resignation in the government and left for Eugene to start a new life.
What year was Eugene, Oregon?
So that was in 1981 or 2, and I was 29 then. That's about it. Maybe a year off or not, I don't know. But I was kind of older for a student already to start a master's and then a PhD. I did a master's in Eugene, and I did not take up a couple of good friends who were offering me to be a business partner with them, who were craftspeople, a couple. And I thought I'd better do a PhD. I liked studying, I was good. And in order to, at that time, I was still didn't know whether I would stay or not stay. But as long as I liked it, I wanted to be able to stay. And for later, I also wanted to be able to stay. So I thought, well, a PhD is, kind of a better deal. So that's when I went to Baltimore.
But Tito's out now, right? He's up
Tito
to
was
like
dead.
1980, 81, something like that?
82 he died.
82 he dies, and then Yugoslavia is in the descent at that point.
Yes.
Did that have an influence on whether or not you were going to return home?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Of course. I mean, I left because I felt that even in, 79, 80, things were already not going so well. We were not progressing as I felt. Like, we're not getting better off by the day, and the morale and the morals were low, both. Morale meaning like people were, morals, I mean, we kind of didn't believe anymore in the socialist dream. When a dream, it becomes propaganda, then either you dream with them or then... And my parents as well felt the same way. My dad, that's where he stopped his career, and it kind of stopped somewhat, not abruptly, but not in great, he just he felt that there were lies there. And
So what ended up with him? What did he end up doing?
He was retired pretty early.
And where did he end up living?
He lived in Belgrade, and he died soon after his retirement.
Oh, that's too bad.
So how did you get from Oregon to Johns Hopkins? And of course, why Johns Hopkins?
So in Oregon, it was a good university, but I was ambitious. I wanted to go to a place that would be more prestigious and where I could have a good enough diploma to find a good job. So, pushing as far as I could. I asked my professors in Eugene what they recommend, and they did recommend a few places. Stanford was a possibility, and actually I was accepted there too, but I wanted to see the East Coast. And also Johns Hopkins, it's like both are...
Right, Johns Hopkins, that's right.
They promised that they would send me for a year to France. And oh wow, a year in Paris at that age when I couldn't just go on my own anymore, I didn't have the money, that sounded very good. So I chose that university above others. I was also, for example, I applied to Princeton and they wanted to see me. And I remember being incensed, like, because I got a letter saying something like, if you are in the area, we would very much like to meet with you. And I thought, well, how can I be in the area? Either you pay my trip or I'm not going to be in the area. It's not like, I don't take a walk from Eugene to... So, and it's good that I didn't. These are excellent schools as well. So, anyway, I ended up at Hopkins, which was, a black poor city and white rich students, and a token black student, but then from, I don't know, Africa or Jamaica or God knows where as a colleague, So a very divided city, very divided. And that was the reality of the United States.
And what was your PhD?
In French literature. My topic, I worked with a French philosopher. I worked on personal writings, memoirs, and that has been my specialty ever since, in a way. So 17th and 18th century literature. I chose earlier literature because there was a 20th century was quite crowded. Everybody wanted to do 20th century. I thought that once you cross this first, barrier for older periods, that they were just as interesting as modern literature. But you had to cross a little barrier linguistically, which wasn't hard for me because that's my native language, so close, same as native. And also somehow to project yourself into the past. So I wrote a thesis on the French memoirs from the French court. And it was literary study, I don't know what, literary criticism, using anthropology, using sociology to a degree, what kind of structure the court is, but also being very attentive to the style of the writer that I was working on, because he was a great writer, and I think that that's something that I want to keep.
Who was the writer?
His name was Saint-Simon, the Duke of Saint-Simon. We all know Saint-Simon or Saint-Simon as one of the first socialists in France. It was the same family, but 200 years earlier. Nothing to do with socialism. He was an aristocrat. Yes, he knew Louis XIV, he knew everything, but what is fabulous is that, a great writer is always a little crazy. So how was he crazy? He observed everything, and hiding, he wrote these memoirs that are like thousands and thousands of pages. He actually depicts something around 7,000 different characters who all existed, and he speaks about them and gives their genealogy and so on. So these are huge memoirs, and he wrote in secret, and he wrote starting, he took notes as a younger man. Nobody knew that he was writing. He was not supposed to be writing because this was a very critical account of the king. He was in kind of opposition. But of course, nobody knew that. I wrote until the age of 86 and then died. So a very, very strange, passion for writing. And I think that's something that I admire, that's why I say writers are something else.
Was there similarities between King Louis XIV's courts in our modern times?
Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely. Well, political circles are somewhat close to that. There are scandals, they're hidden, there is insincerity, there is flattery, there is turnarounds, loss of power. Well, not the king, we have a president and they may lose or gain power. They had one figure, that was the king, who always kept power until Louis XVI.
Yes.
But the rest of the people, they can just go in and out. The mistresses, the wives, and so on. Basically, it was a world where everybody knew each other. Um, and also the world where there were no wars like physical or any such thing. Everybody was very polite, but they of course hated each other oftentimes, worked against each other, the intrigues and so on. So all of that resembles either the political society or even like a university in a way.
So how did you discover this writer?
Yeah, that was the first who told me to read him was actually the person who became my thesis advisor. And he was a very perspicacious person because he was not a literary person, a philosopher. And I wanted to write on a topic that would be something with society, something about society, something social. He knew that I was, kind of politically interested in society more than in poetics or versification or something like that. And so I had some ideas and he told me, no, that wouldn't work. Theater is not enough. It speaks of society, but it has its structures and these structures are kind of eternal and comedy is comedy. Why don't you read a memoir author? And he pointed me to Saint-Simon, whom I didn't really know. So I started reading, and since, as I said, I'm nearsighted, or I don't like to think too much ahead, what I saw there is like 7 volumes, huge volumes. I thought, okay, I don't know how to decide about the thesis topic. So here I have an excellent excuse for not deciding. I'm just going to tell him I'm reading the memoirs. I need some more time. And that's how it started.
And how long did it take you to do that?
Oh yeah, I probably read them in less than a year the first time. But then when you write on something, then you read and reread and reread. So altogether, a lot of reading, yeah.
And that was the 80s, right? That must be 85, 86?
86, yeah. 86, all throughout 90. Yeah.
So
84 actually.
From a PhD to where?
Yeah, where's that?
That's where all my tribulations stopped. I got the job here in Los Angeles, and here I am.
Had you ever been to Los Angeles before?
Yes, I had, and it was a fabulous city. I loved it. For a very long time, I was in love with Paris, and I had my love affair with Paris, and I really fully lived it. And then I saw Los Angeles, and I fell in love with Los Angeles. And so I was very, very lucky. I think that this was the best job that I could have gotten, that I dreamed of. Of course, no honeymoon lasts forever, so after a while you realize that
And what is that job?
Well, I'm a professor at U.C.L.A. I did all the steps. I teach
UCLA?
French literature. I was assistant professor, then I became associate professor, then full professor. Here I am.
Married, too.
Yes, after...
There's somebody floating around the house or out on a bicycle ride right now?
So, all of this that I was telling you, I was actually alone. My studies, my life in Yugoslavia, I didn't have a mate and didn't have any long-term relationships. And I think I was really taking care of what I had to take care of in a way.
Which was what?
To get to where my ambition and adventurous spirit were leading me.
Which was where? Was it UCLA?
Yeah. Like a job that's creative enough. I am a writer, a scholar, a teacher, and I live in this beautiful city.
Well, talking about being a writer, I was reading your biography, and you do write biographies, right?
Including your own.
I wrote my own autobiography, but only parts. I mean, not everything that I'm telling you is there by any means. But I wrote it in French, and I still haven't been able to publish it. Hopefully it will come, but I'm trying to have it published.
Have you written more biographies?
Well, I don't write biographies. My literary studies are about one author, so in some ways they are to a degree biographical, but really it's more about the person as a writer than a person as a person. But the person as a person is already in their writing because they wrote their autobiography. I wrote another book about another figure, like a church figure and a political faction figure and opposition. His name was Cardinal de Retz, or Re, and he was during the Civil War of the Fronde in mid-17th century France. He was pretty high in the church. He was going to be, or was at some point, became the Bishop of Paris. But at that point, he was actually already in prison because he was took part in the Fronde revolt and was imprisoned by the king. So quite a controversial figure, political memoirs, and so about politics. So in some ways, this is also very close to politics, not as we like to think they are, but as they really are, which means dirty.
When you're doing the research for these biographies, do you have letters? Do you have other people writing about them?
Yes.
How extensive is it? Can you talk about that?
Yes. Letters, definitely. Anything that this author has published gets read and digested or interpreted if I need to, depends. And of course I read everything that people have written about them. Now this is not, as I say, it's not a biography. You could do that, but I don't go through their life explaining. It's more like a literary study. So what I would do is maybe something like what does this person write about politics and how he did it? What does this tell us about politics at the court, or politics, what I call Baroque politics, politics as a practice, rather than just, abstract ideas. So if it is that, then how does he observe psychologically other people? What does he say about them? What can he write or not, even if it is just in secret and for themselves? What are his obsessions? Why these obsessions and not others? When I say obsessions, I mean like themes that they would be pushing, like, because we all have our obsessions, so when you write your life, somebody can read through it and see what your preoccupations, your main worries, your main ideals were. So it's kind of an analysis of that. It's not chronological.
Right. So lots of us here in America are immigrants, and we have little strings to our places of origin. Mm-hmm. And so what went through your mind? What were you thinking during the fall of Yugoslavia, the Balkan Wars in the 90s? I mean, you must have had friends, family.
Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, it was very hard. Yeah, I was away, so in some ways I wasn't touched directly, although I was to a certain degree. But for example, I still don't know if some of the people that I was friends with are alive or not, because they were from a city where there were like massacres, and I don't know if, I haven't found them, or I didn't. My cousin was trying to escape the military in Belgrade to not go serve. He didn't want to, so hiding. So things of that kind. All the young people here. I mean, we had a number of immigrants here. Like pilots, young boys, guys, who all either they were going to serve the military or they had to get out of the country, which a lot of them did. There was so many emigration. The whole generation of girls of that age stayed single. There is no boys anymore. I mean, my cousin is one of them. So, but that's nothing. When I would look at the newspaper and see the pictures, I felt awful because it was my people massacring my people. For me, there is no difference. I didn't feel, and in Belgrade, we were not nationalists at all. This was a war of a countryside against big cities in a way. It was also a lot of unsolved ethnic grudges from the Second World War, unresolved history. History is very important to study and to unearth and to forgive and to understand. And we had put it under the carpet, and that was where the socialist regime didn't help, because we were all like starry-eyed, let's forget about massacres in the Second World War. But people didn't forget. And of course, I personally always thought that it was the economy stupid, as they say, because it's only when we started going downhill economically that all of that became so important. So suddenly they unearthed history, and a lot of this was reinvented. I think history is reinvented every 2 or 3 years or constantly. What is important? Is this important or was that important? So all of that was. Then there was the other war again in Serbia. It was the one with Kosovo, and that was
The late 90s there.
yes. That's when Belgrade got bombarded. My friends were bombarded or close. They didn't die or anything, but they saw missiles in their street. That is terrible. They hated some of my friends hate Americans from then on. I was in Paris at that time. That was 90.
Now, why would they hate Americans?
Because the Americans bombarded the NATO,
okay.
and the Americans bombarded Serbia
Right.
in order to stop the Kosovo massacre. But in Belgrade, people didn't know about it or would not necessarily be for it, or were just living their life as civils and not,
There's always the innocent that are
yeah.
victimized.
There were not too many dead people, but that was too many for them.
So I take it you've never been back to the area again in life? You've never returned?
Oh no, I return all the time.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah.
So what's it like now?
Oh, it's like backwater, basically. Nobody knows what's happening. You don't know what's happening in Serbia. That's because nothing is happening much. People live. There is no war. There is no terrorism. We have very little immigration because all the immigrants who went through Yugoslavia, or the countries that now form Yugoslavia, wanted to get to Germany, so they just went through, basically. Yeah. They're gone.
They're rebuilding?
Hmm?
Has there been rebuilding?
Yes, it's always building, rebuilding. Belgrade was not destroyed, let's face it. There were a few buildings destroyed, and the government specifically did not rebuild them to remind everybody that we were bombarded by the NATO. So we have the ministry, the ARC for the army, which was just across where my dad worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's like a horrible ruin falling apart, and they left it as is. Of course, there is no more federal government in Belgrade, so all these buildings are kind of useless in a way, anyhow.
So there's all these different countries now.
Yeah.
Does that make people more peaceable? Is there a difference between how the cultures coexist now than when it was more
I think
federation?
A divorce is better than a war. So for now, I think that in next 100 years they might come back together. I don't know, or some at least. We are still quite similar. We didn't come together because somebody named Tito told us to. This was from 1848, the Southern Slavs are brothers and they want to live together, so there is this and that. It's not just ethnic conflict, it's also ethnic similarity, cooperation, whatever. We speak the same language pretty much, so.
Okay, so now that you're an American citizen, I guess not how do you feel about America, but sort of reflect on America and its positive influence in your life.
Okay, positive influence. Well, the one thing that I must say, and my hat.
Because you stayed.
America has welcomed me. I couldn't do what I do anywhere else. And I have never felt actually that I was, given a short shrift or a lower status or anything like that because I was an immigrant. And that's unheard of in Europe, anywhere. You come to a country and you're always kind of second-rate citizen. And here you're not. That is probably the most positive thing that I can say. Then, America is full of great people. All my friends here are great people, and that's what I try to tell my friends back home when I go. Because they say, yeah, but America, the politics. And it's true, the politics are sometimes awful. And this state is not necessarily, I respect the French state more than the American state. However, people in America often have the same opinion as I do. All my friends are Americans, and yet they're my friends. So that's what I'm trying to tell them, it's a great country, but ignore the politics. I cannot understand that very well, I have to say, because I have had, I don't know how to say, respect for governments. I mentioned the French government, I can mention the Swiss government, but even our poor government while it was working, but there were problems, definitely. So maybe the government is what the people are like, I suppose. I'm not sure I understand this will to not have government. I respect the American government, but it has its hands tied. You have decent people working, and then it happens that the president decides that they're going to be working without a pay but all of these people are decent people, they're part of the government. They're not so greatly paid. Government has lots of institutions and lots of, who is going to take care of this federal level if not the government? So I don't understand the word free, to be free, I also don't understand that, because I don't think we're ever free, capital F. We are free from, free to a degree, free in our illusions, but we're not free. Nobody's free. I don't believe that.
The two French writers that you were talking about, those are only two that I know because those are two you mentioned. They both were alive around the time of the American Revolution, or prior. They were actually prior, right?
Prior, both.
Were they part of the Enlightenment?
No, but I am now working on somebody who was part of the Enlightenment in a very strange way. It's a third writer, and as I say, in a very strange way, it's a kind of a controversial figure, but a very interesting figure and an excellent writer. And his name, I'm sure you'll know, is Casanova. I think you must be an excellent writer to start a legend about yourself that lasts for 300 years. I mean, just do it if you can. Because we don't know anything but from his writing. There are a few, things that people knew about him. He was not completely unknown. He had friends, there is correspondence. Yet nobody was in his bedroom but him and the women involved, and sometimes even a man involved. So what was happening there, he described it, and he described it so that he remained a legend. So that's what I say about writing. Writing has a power. Everybody takes that power elsewhere, but that is the power of writing.
All right, so Casanova, you said, was part of the Enlightenment.
Yes, he was. He was a strange part. Maybe being a seducer is not very enlightened. That's not what I mean. But he was a man of letters. He traveled a lot. He spent his whole life traveling. He knew Voltaire. He knew everybody. He knew the doctors. He was interested in medicine. He wrote about medicine. He was a poet as well. So in many ways, he was part of the Enlightenment as like a movement, pan-European, critical, questioning religion. He's at the time of the French Revolution, he was still alive but quite old, and he was against it because it was chaotic. But that was, the end of his life. life. And he was at that time in the Czech Republic, and that's where he died.
How come we're so difficult when we Americans, when it comes to government and the distrust with government, and what was that born from? And I was just wondering if you have an observation of that.
I think it's, well, to a degree, it's lack of education, in a way, lack of possibility of comparing. So it's like, to a degree, indoctrination. You know, these big labels, like we are free, land of the free, of the
Home of the brave.
Home of the brave. I had my students who were like taking that argument, and I'm like, oh my God, you know, what is free, what is not? It's true, there are levels of freedom. I would rather live here than, I don't know, in the Philippines or in the Congo. Yes, and absolutely. But there is no such thing as absolute freedom. And freedom from what? And I don't know how to explain it. I think it's indoctrination. I think education should, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say there. It's really, at the same time as I admire the spirit of independence, here, you know, you have your little project. And that's not something that back in Yugoslavia or even in France would happen so easily. Why? People kind of settle down and kind of lose their energy and don't think they can do something, and they become somewhat pessimistic and stale. That is what's happening in Europe. And that's not happening in the United States. What is happening is some people just take a gun and shoot everybody because they can't take it anymore. Others do much better things. Okay, so it's extremes. It is extreme, but I don't know. Yugoslavia was black and white. Nothing was in color in Belgrade, and still isn't. When I came to Oregon, I opened my eyes to colors, to green, to beauty in a way. It was the main thing that I would say is like, it's not a political difference. It's difference in money, in how well you can live. That's so important. We were not that well off. I was kind of belonged to an elite, but still, you know, going to friend's place and like the bathrooms, the way, oh my God, and I don't know, it's just, you know, this kind of somewhat poverty, somewhat. And that's maybe something that you see in the film, you know, it was, that's why the films are good, but they are black and white.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and you took the bus, and you know, that's how it was. Everything was a little rougher.
Thank you.
Yeah, Maiina, thank you. Another neighbor for sharing your story with us.
Tell me your story. Tell me where you come from, you. Ya ta 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 ta. Tell me who you loved. Tell me who loved you. Ya ta